They say the Lord tests us in ways we never see coming, but nothing could have prepared Jake Thompson for what he found on Highway 287 that muggy Texas morning. A massive Brahman bull stood motionless beside the asphalt, his dark eyes fixed on something that made Jake's blood run cold. There, coiled around a beautiful cream-colored female, was 20 feet of pure nightmare. A Burmese python thick as a fence post, squeezing the life out of her with methodical precision. The bull they'd later call Thunder wasn't moving, wasn't charging, wasn't doing anything except watching his mate die inch by agonizing inch. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, his hand trembling as he reached for the radio. The female's breathing was so shallow he could barely see her chest rise. Her eyes, wide with terror and pain, found his through the morning haze. Thunder's massive head turned toward Jake then, and in those ancient brown eyes was something that cut straight through to his soul, a plea that transcended species, a desperate cry that said what words never could. "Please, don't let her suffer alone." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Jake's radio crackled to life as he called in the emergency, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47 on Highway 287, mile marker 15. I need veterinary backup and... hell, I don't know what I need. We got a situation here that defies all common sense." Within 15 minutes, Dr. Sarah Wilson Mitchell's pickup truck came barreling down the highway, dust kicking up behind her like a prayer sent skyward. She'd been the county's large animal veterinarian for 3 years now, ever since moving back from Dallas, but nothing in her training had prepared her for this tableau of desperate devotion. The moment Sarah stepped out of her truck and saw the two bulls, something shifted in her chest. Her coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hot asphalt, dark liquid spreading like spilled blood. Thunder's eyes met hers across the 20 yards of tarmac, and she could have sworn she saw recognition flicker in those depths. "How long has he been standing there?" she asked Jake, never taking her eyes off the massive bull. "Going on 40 minutes now, hasn't moved a muscle, hasn't made a sound, just watching." Jake wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "That python's got to be 18 feet if it's an inch. Never seen one this far north in Texas." Sarah approached slowly, her veterinary bag heavy in her hand. The python was indeed massive, its coils wrapped around the female with deadly efficiency. Each time the cow exhaled, the snake tightened its grip, a living vice that would eventually crush the life from her lungs. But it was Thunder that held Sarah's attention. The bull stood like a sentinel, his powerful frame trembling with barely contained emotion. Dried tears had left salt tracks down his massive face, something Sarah had only read about in veterinary journals but never witnessed firsthand. "Easy, big fellow," she whispered, extending her hand palm up in a gesture as old as humanity itself. "We're here to help." Thunder's nostrils flared as he caught her scent. His massive head lowered slightly, and Sarah could see a heart-shaped scar carved into his left horn, clearly man-made, clearly deliberate. The sight of it sent an unexpected jolt of memory through her, though she couldn't place why. The radio in Jake's truck squawked again. "Unit 47, what's your ETA on resolution? We got news crews getting wind of this, and the highway department wants that road cleared." Sarah looked at the dying cow, at the devoted bull, at the snake that didn't belong in Texas rangeland. Tell them, she said quietly, that some things can't be rushed. Love doesn't operate on highway department schedules. Thunder huffed softly, as if he understood every word. 30 years earlier, on this very stretch of East Texas rangeland, Tom Wilson had been a different man. The Vietnam War had left its mark on him the way fire leaves scars on good timber, visible reminders of heat that had nearly consumed everything. His hands shook when thunder rolled across the prairie, and he woke most nights in a cold sweat, calling out names of boys who'd never made it home. It was his wife, Martha, who'd suggested they try raising cattle. "Maybe taking care of something will help you remember how to take care of yourself," she'd said in that gentle way of hers, never pushing, always suggesting. The Wilson Ranch had been in the family for 3 generations, but Tom had never shown much interest in ranching before the war changed everything. The day Thunder arrived, he wasn't much more than a calf, maybe 6 months old. The previous owner had called Tom with desperation thick in his voice. "I got this bull calf that ain't right in the head," the man had said. "Been abused something fierce before I got him. Won't let nobody near him. Won't eat proper. I'm fixing to put him down unless you want him." Tom had driven the 40 miles to pick up Thunder in his old Ford, not knowing that he was about to meet the creature who would save his soul. The calf was skin and bones, his eyes wild with a terror Tom recognized all too well. Deep scars crisscrossed his hide where someone had used him for fighting practice, teaching dogs to attack cattle. When Tom approached the pen, the young bull pressed himself into the farthest corner, trembling like a leaf in a windstorm. "Easy there, son," Tom had whispered, settling himself on the ground outside the pen. "I know exactly how you feel. Sometimes the world hurts you so bad you forget that not everyone's looking to cause pain." For 3 hours, Tom sat in the dust, talking to that traumatized calf about everything and nothing. He told him about the rice paddies of Vietnam, about losing friends to landmines, about coming home to a country that didn't want to hear about the war. He talked until his throat was dry and the sun started setting. And somewhere in those rambling words, the calf stopped shaking. When Tom finally stood to leave, the young bull followed him to the gate. "Looks like you got yourself a shadow," the owner had said, amazement clear in his voice. Never seen him move toward a human before. Tom named him Thunder because of the way his hooves sounded on the wooden floors of the old barn, like distant artillery that no longer made Tom's heart race with panic. Having something depend on him, something that needed his gentleness rather than his strength, began to heal places in Tom's spirit that medical doctors couldn't reach. But Thunder was still troubled, still prone to fits of terror that would send him charging blindly across the pasture. That's when Tom made the decision that would define both their lives. Gentle arrived 6 months later, a heifer calf from champion bloodstock. Tom had spent nearly everything they had saved to buy her, ignoring Martha's worried questions about their bank account. But Tom had seen something in the way Thunder perked up whenever other cattle were near. The bull wasn't meant to be alone. The moment Gentle stepped out of the trailer, Thunder's whole world changed. Here was another creature who didn't carry the scent of fear or violence. She approached him with the curiosity of youth, sniffing at his scarred hide without flinching, nudging him with her soft muzzle when he tried to retreat. Within a week, they were inseparable. Gentle seemed to understand Thunder's trauma in ways that defied explanation. when storms rolled across the prairie and Thunder began to panic. She would press her warm body against his, her steady breathing calming his racing heart. When Thunder's nightmares made him call out in the darkness, Gentle would answer with low, soothing sounds that meant safety, meant home. Tom watched their bond develop with something approaching wonder. "It's like she knows exactly what he needs," he told Martha one evening as they observed the pair from their kitchen window. Thunder was grazing peacefully while Gentle stood guard, her alert eyes scanning the horizon for any threats to her beloved companion. "Animals understand trauma better than we do sometimes," Martha had replied, her hand finding Tom's across the kitchen table. "They don't try to fix it or explain it away. They just love through it." As the years passed, Tom began to carve a small heart into Thunder's left horn, a ritual that became their private symbol of the love that had healed them both. Each year, he would deepen the carving just a little, marking another year of survival, another year of choosing trust over fear. The three of them, Tom, Thunder, and Gentle, became fixtures in the small community. Neighbors would bring their children to see the gentle giants who seemed to understand human sorrow. Tom found himself talking to visitors about the healing power of caring for something beyond yourself, about how love could transform even the deepest wounds. But it was when Martha died suddenly of a heart attack that Thunder and Gentle proved the depth of their understanding. For 3 days after the funeral, they refused to leave the area near the house. They stood vigil in the pasture closest to the kitchen window where Martha used to watch them, their heads lowered in what could only be described as mourning. Tom found them there on the 3rd morning, Gentle's massive head resting across Thunder's neck, both of them looking toward the empty house with expressions that broke his heart all over again. "You two understand, don't you?" he whispered, his voice raw with grief. "She's gone, but we're still here. We still got each other." Thunder lifted his great head and looked directly at Tom, those dark eyes full of a wisdom that transcended species. In that moment, Tom realized that love wasn't just what had saved Thunder from his trauma. It was what would save all of them from the loneliness that threatened to consume everything good in the world. His granddaughter Sarah had been just 5 years old then, but she remembered that day with crystal clarity. She remembered how the 2 bulls had seemed to wrap her grandfather in invisible wings of comfort, how their presence had somehow made the unbearable weight of loss just a little lighter. She remembered, too, her grandfather's words as they stood together watching Thunder and Gentle in the fading light. "Some bonds run deeper than blood, sweetheart. Some love is strong enough to heal what seems broken beyond repair." Now, 30 years later, standing on that same stretch of highway with Thunder's desperate eyes boring into her soul, Sarah finally understood what her grandfather had tried to teach her about the sacred nature of loyalty, about love that endures beyond all reasonable hope. Back on Highway 287, the morning sun climbed higher, turning the asphalt into a shimmering furnace. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead as she surveyed the scene with professional eyes, her veterinary training warring with emotions she couldn't quite name. The python's grip around Gentle had tightened perceptibly in the last 20 minutes, and the cow's breathing had become more labored, more desperate. "We're running out of time," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of hard truth. "That snake's gonna crush her ribs if we don't do something soon." The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the morning air. First the county sheriff's patrol car, then a truck from the State Wildlife Department, followed by what looked like half the town's volunteer fire department. Word was spreading fast in the way that only small Texas communities could manage, and Sarah felt the familiar knot of pressure building in her stomach. Sheriff Bob Martinez climbed out of his patrol car, his weathered face grim. "Sarah, Jake," he nodded to each of them. "What's our situation here?" Before either could answer, Dr. Emily Patterson from the Wildlife Department jogged over, her equipment bag bouncing against her hip. "I brought tranquilizer guns," she announced breathlessly. "We can put that bull down for a few hours, get the snake off the female, and sort this mess out proper." Thunder's massive head swung toward the sound of Emily's voice, his nostrils flaring. The bull took 2 steps closer to Gentle, positioning himself directly between the gathering humans and his mate. His message was clear as gospel. "You'll have to go through me first." "Now, hold on just a minute," Sarah said, raising her hand. "You sedate him, and you break something that can't be fixed. Look at him. Really look. He's not being aggressive. He's being protective. There's a difference." Sheriff Martinez squinted at Thunder, taking in the bull's stance. "I see a 2,000-pound animal that could charge at any second. My job is public safety, not animal psychology." "And my job," Sarah shot back, "is understanding what these animals need. That bull isn't going to hurt anyone unless we force his hand." The argument that followed would be talked about in Millfield for years to come. Voices raised in the heat, hands gesticulating toward the patient bull who stood his ground while his mate fought for every breath. The volunteer firefighters formed a rough circle, some agreeing with the sheriff's caution, others nodding along with Sarah's passionate defense. "You're talking about risking human lives for a couple of cattle," Emily argued, her voice sharp with frustration. "I've seen bulls charge before. They don't always give warning." "These aren't just cattle," Sarah found herself saying, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. They're family." The admission hung in the air like morning mist, and Sarah felt every eye turned toward her. She'd revealed more than she intended, more than she was ready to explain. But looking at Thunder's determined stance, at the way he refused to abandon Gentle despite the growing crowd of strangers, she couldn't take the words back. Jake stepped closer to Sarah, his voice low. "You know these animals, don't you?" Before she could answer, young Billy Thompson, Jake's nephew who'd been monitoring the radio chatter, came running up with news that changed everything. "Dr. Mitchell, you need to hear this. That python's got a collar on it, and it's got a pet store tag from Dallas. Someone called in about an hour ago, said they lost their baby about 3 months back." The implications hit everyone at once. This wasn't nature running its course. This was human negligence coming home to roost. Someone had bought an exotic pet they couldn't handle, let it grow too large for their suburban home, and then simply abandoned it to the wild. The python wasn't a predator following instinct. It was a confused, hungry animal trying to survive in an environment it was never meant to inhabit. 3 months, Sarah said quietly. That snake's been struggling to survive for 3 months. No wonder it's desperate enough to attack something this size. The moral complexity of the situation settled over the gathered crowd like a heavy blanket. Here was a victim attacking another victim, both suffering from human choices made in ignorance or selfishness. The python was as much a casualty as gentle, and Thunder was caught in the middle, trying to protect what he loved from a threat none of them had created. "Changes things, doesn't it?" Jake murmured, as if sensing the shift in the human's attention. Thunder took a careful step toward Sarah, his massive head lowered, and those dark eyes that had haunted her since she'd arrived fixed on her face. There was something in his gaze, recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the desperate hope of any creature that had run out of options. Sarah found herself moving toward him, her hand extended palm up in the universal gesture of peace. "Easy, big guy," she whispered. "I know you're scared. I know you don't know who to trust." Thunder's nostrils flared as he caught her scent, and Sarah saw his entire body go still. For a moment that stretched like eternity, bull and woman studied each other across 3 feet of shimmering asphalt. Then Thunder did something that made the entire crowd gasp. He lowered his massive head and gently touched his muzzle to Sarah's outstretched palm. The contact lasted only seconds, but in that brief connection, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just professional compassion, this was personal. This was recognition of a bond that stretched back through years and memory, to a time when she'd been young enough to believe that love could conquer anything. "Jesus," Sheriff Martinez breathed. "I've never seen anything like that." But their moment of wonder was shattered by a new sound, Gentle's breathing becoming more ragged, more desperate. The python, perhaps sensing the increased activity around its prey, was tightening its coils again. Time was running out faster than anyone had anticipated. "We need to make a decision," Emily said urgently. "That cow's got maybe 30 minutes before those ribs start cracking." Sarah looked at Thunder, who had turned back toward his mate, his body language screaming anguish. She thought about her grandfather's stories, about the bond between these two creatures that had endured longer than most human marriages. She thought about the heart-shaped scar on Thunder's horn and the recognition in his eyes when he'd looked at her. "I have an idea," she said quietly. "But it's going to require all of us to trust something we don't fully understand." The storm clouds that had been building on the horizon chose that moment to rumble with distant thunder, and Sarah saw Thunder's ears prick forward nervously. Even after all these years, storms still made him anxious. But instead of panic, instead of the wild flight response that might have been expected, Thunder moved closer to Gentle, positioning himself to shield her from both the approaching weather and the circle of humans who held her fate in their hands. "What kind of idea?" Sheriff Martinez asked, though his tone suggested he was already regretting the question. Sarah looked around at the faces of her neighbors, people she'd known all her life, people who trusted her judgment with their own animals. She thought about the phone calls she'd received over the years, the midnight emergencies where she'd saved horses and cattle and even the occasional exotic pet that someone had loved enough to seek help for. "We're going to ask Thunder to help us save Gentle," she said simply. "We're going to trust him to understand that we're on the same side." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rumble of approaching thunder and the labored breathing of a dying cow. In that moment, human and animal, trust and fear, love and loss all hung in the balance on a stretch of Texas highway where the impossible was about to become the only option left. As the crowd debated their next move, Sarah found herself drawn back to her truck, searching for something she couldn't quite name. Her hands moved automatically to the glove compartment, past the registration papers and emergency supplies, until her fingers closed around a worn leather journal she'd forgotten was there. Her grandfather's journal, the one she'd found in his desk drawer after the funeral 3 years ago, but had never found the courage to read. The sight of Tom Wilson's familiar handwriting on the yellowed pages made her breath catch. She'd always meant to read through it, but grief had a way of making even the simplest tasks feel insurmountable. Now, with Thunder's desperate eyes still fresh in her memory, she found herself flipping through pages of careful observations, sketches of cattle, and notes about veterinary care. But it was a particular entry, dated 30 years ago, that made her heart stop completely. Thunder and Gentle aren't like other cattle. Doc Patterson said I was crazy for spending so much on what most folks would call livestock, but he doesn't understand what I saw in that bull's eyes. These two have been through hell. Thunder from those dog-fighting rings, and Gentle from a breeding operation that treated her like a machine instead of a living soul. They're not just cattle. They're survivors. They're family. Sarah's hands trembled as she read further, her grandfather's words painting a picture she'd never fully understood as a child. Had to take Thunder to Doc Patterson again today. The nightmares are getting worse, yes. Nightmares. And anyone who says cattle don't dream has never watched Thunder wake up in a cold sweat, calling out for something that ain't there. Doc says it's impossible. But I know trauma when I see it. Takes one to know one, I suppose. Gentle's the only thing that calms him down. She understands his pain in ways I never could. The journal entries continued, documenting years of careful observation of a man who saw beyond the surface to the souls of the creatures he cared for. But it was the final entry, dated just days before Tom's death, that shattered everything Sarah thought she knew. Sarah came by today with talk about selling the ranch, moving closer to Dallas. I can't blame her. This place holds too many memories, too much heartache. But Thunder and Gentle don't understand real estate or inheritance taxes. They only understand love and loyalty. I'm leaving them to her because I have to believe, that she'll remember what I taught her about seeing the heart of something, not just its market value. These bulls saved my life. Maybe someday they'll save hers too. Sarah's legs gave out, and she found herself sitting on the running board of her truck. The journal clutched against her chest. Around her, the debate about tranquilizers and safety protocols continued, but their voices seemed to come from underwater. Everything was different now. The way Thunder had recognized her scent, the heart-shaped scar on his horn, the impossible gentleness in his eyes despite his massive size. Dr. Mitchell, Jake's voice cut through her stunned silence. You find something in there. Sarah looked up to see the gathering crowd watching her with concern. Sheriff Martinez approached cautiously, his weathered face showing the kind of patience that came from years of dealing with people in crisis. These aren't random cattle, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. They were my grandfather's. Thunder and Gentle. I thought they'd been sold years ago when we settled the estate. The revelation rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Suddenly, the intensive care Sarah had been advocating for made perfect sense. This wasn't just professional veterinary judgment, this was personal. This was family. Emily Patterson lowered her tranquilizer gun, her expression shifting from frustration to understanding. Your grandfather's animals, but the ranch was sold 3 years ago to the Henderson family. Apparently, Sarah said, standing on unsteady legs. The Hendersons bought more than they bargained for. She looked across the highway to where Thunder maintained his vigil beside Gentle, and felt the weight of 3 years of misunderstanding settle on her shoulders. My grandfather left them to me in his will. I never realized they were still alive. The moral complexity of the situation deepened exponentially. Here were 2 creatures who had been abandoned not once, but twice. First by Sarah's unknowing neglect of her inheritance, then by their current owners who had seen them as nothing more than livestock to be left to wander. Jake scratched his head beneath his hat. So you're saying that bull over there knows you? That's why he let you touch him? That's exactly what I'm saying. Sarah opened the journal to a page filled with sketches of Thunder as a young calf, the heart-shaped notch in his horn clearly visible even then. My grandfather carved that mark when Thunder was just a baby. It was his way of marking something precious, something that belonged to the family. The crowd gathered closer as Sarah read aloud from her grandfather's careful observations. Stories of Thunder's nightmares, of Gentle's protective instincts, of 2 traumatized animals who had found healing in each other's company. With each word, the assembled neighbors began to see the scene before them with new eyes. "Lord have mercy," whispered Mrs. Patterson from the general store. "Tom Wilson used to bring those bulls into town sometimes. I remember now. They'd follow him around like big dogs. Never seen anything like it." Old Pete Gonzalez, who'd worked cattle all his life, nodded slowly. "Tom always said those 2 were special. Rest of us thought he was just getting soft in his old age, but maybe he saw something we didn't." The transformation in the crowd's attitude was palpable. What had begun as a debate about public safety and animal control had become something much more profound. A recognition of bonds that transcended species, of love that endured despite abandonment and misunderstanding. But their moment of revelation was interrupted by a sharp cry from Gentle. The python had begun to shift its coils, sensing perhaps that its prey was weakening. Thunder's response was immediate and heartbreaking, a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "We're losing her," Emily said urgently. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." Sarah closed the journal and looked at Thunder with new understanding. This wasn't just about saving a cow from a python. This was about honoring a legacy of love that had been neglected for 3 years, about making amends for abandonment that had never been intended, but had happened nonetheless. "Thunder," she called softly, using the voice she remembered from childhood visits to the ranch. "Thunder, do you remember me? Do you remember Grandpa Tom?" The massive bull turned toward her voice, and in his eyes Sarah saw not just recognition, but something deeper. Forgiveness for the years of separation. Hope that maybe, finally, someone understood what he'd been trying to protect all along. The storm clouds overhead chose that moment to release their first drops of rain, spattering the hot asphalt with dark circles that spread like tears. Time was running out in more ways than one, and Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine not just whether Gentle survived, but whether the bonds her grandfather had spent a lifetime nurturing could be restored. "All right," Thunder, she whispered, stepping toward him with her grandfather's journal still clutched in her hand. Let's save her together. The rain began in earnest now, turning the Texas dust into mud and making the asphalt slick beneath their feet. Sarah approached Thunder with careful steps, her grandfather's journal tucked inside her jacket to protect it from the weather. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, news trucks arriving from nearby towns, their satellite dishes reaching toward the stormy sky like mechanical prayers. Easy. Thunder, Sarah murmured, using the same tone she remembered Tom Wilson using all those years ago. We're going to help Gentle, but I need you to trust me, the way you trusted Grandpa. Thunder's massive head turned toward her, rain streaming down his scarred hide like tears. For a moment that seemed to stretch across decades, Sarah saw herself as a 5-year-old girl again, standing in this very pasture while her grandfather explained the sacred nature of the bond between the two bulls. Animals don't lie, sweetheart, Tom's voice echoed in her memory. They don't pretend to love you for what you can give them. When they choose you, it's because they see something in your heart that even you might not know is there. Present. 8:15 a.m. The python's coils shifted slightly as the rain began to affect its grip. Doctor. Emily Patterson consulted with the wildlife team, their voices urgent as they discussed the challenges of handling a massive snake in increasingly treacherous conditions. Rain's going to make this more dangerous, Sheriff Martinez observed, his hand resting on his radio. That snake's going to be more unpredictable, and visibility's going down. But Sarah barely heard the concerns swirling around her. All her attention was focused on Thunder, who had begun to respond to her presence with subtle changes in posture. His ears, which had been pinned back in defensive anxiety, were now pricked forward with interest. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, was beginning to slow. That's it, big guy, she whispered, extending her hand toward the heart-shaped scar on his horn. You remember, don't you? You remember when this meant family. Flashback. 3 years ago. The lawyer's office had smelled of old leather and disappointment. Sarah sat across from Mr. Henderson, the man who'd bought her grandfather's ranch, as they discussed the final details of the estate settlement. Now, about the cattle, Mr. Henderson had said, shuffling through papers with the casual efficiency of someone accustomed to treating living creatures as inventory. The will specifically mentions 2 Brahman bulls that are to go to you. Miss Wilson, Thunder, and Gentle. I believe Sarah's mother, Margaret, had made a sharp noise of disapproval. Sarah's living in a Dallas apartment. Harold, she can't take care of cattle. Just sell them with the rest of the herd. But the will is very specific, the lawyer had protested. Your father left detailed instructions about these particular animals. Sarah remembered the crushing weight of grief that had made every decision feel impossible. Her grandfather had died suddenly, and she'd been struggling just to keep her veterinary practice afloat while dealing with the emotional aftermath. The idea of taking on 2 massive bulls had seemed absurd, impractical. Mom's right, she'd said finally, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I can't take them. Just make sure they go to someone who'll take good care of them. Mr. Henderson had nodded with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions simple. I'll keep them with my herd. They're valuable animals. Good bloodlines. They'll be fine. But fine. Sarah realized now, wasn't the same as loved. Fine wasn't the same as understood. Present. 8:30 a.m. Dr. Mitchell? Jake's voice cut through her memories. Look at that snake. The python had begun to behave strangely, its coils loosening slightly around Gentle's midsection. The rain was affecting its grip, but there was something else. The snake's movements were becoming more sluggish, less coordinated. Emily Patterson approached with her equipment, her expression puzzled. That's not normal python behavior. They usually get more active when they're stressed, not less. As if responding to some invisible signal. Thunder took a step closer to Sarah. His massive bulk blocked the wind-driven rain from her face, and she realized he was positioning himself to protect her, just as he'd been protecting Gentle. "He's trying to tell us something," Sarah said, her hand resting on Thunder's neck. Through the thick hide, she could feel his heartbeat, rapid but steady, the rhythm of a creature making an enormous effort to communicate across the species divide. Social media storm. Unknown to the people gathered on Highway 287, the story was exploding across social media platforms. Someone had live-streamed the standoff, and #Thunder and Gentle was trending nationwide. Comments poured in from around the world, some supporting the bull's loyalty, others demanding immediate action to resolve the situation. This is what love looks like, refusing to abandon someone no matter what. Just tranquilize the bull and get this over with. Animals have deeper emotions than most humans. This is dangerous and irresponsible. Public safety should come first. The debate raging online mirrored the one happening in real time on the rain-soaked highway, but with even less nuance and far more passion. Present. 8:45 a.m. News reporter Jessica Chen arrived with her camera crew, their van pulling up just as the rain began to ease. Within minutes, she was broadcasting live, her voice carrying across the airwaves to millions of viewers. I'm standing on Highway 287 in East Texas, where an extraordinary drama is unfolding. A Brahman bull named Thunder has been standing guard over his mate Gentle for nearly 3 hours, refusing to leave her side as she fights for her life against a massive python. The camera panned across the scene, Thunder's unwavering vigil, the python's deadly embrace. The crowd of locals who had gathered to witness what many were calling a testament to the power of love that transcends species. Flashback. Sarah's guilt, standing in the rain, watching Thunder's desperate devotion. Sarah was overwhelmed by memories of her own abandonment, not just of the bulls, but of everything her grandfather had tried to teach her about the sacred responsibility that came with being chosen by another living creature. She remembered Thunder and Gentle as youngsters, following her grandfather around the ranch like enormous, devoted dogs. She remembered the way they would gentle when children came to visit, as if they understood their own size and the need for careful movement around smaller, more fragile beings. Most painfully, she remembered the day she'd left for college, how Thunder had followed her car to the gate and stood watching until she disappeared around the bend. She'd been 18 then, eager to escape what she'd seen as the limitations of rural life. She'd never looked back to see if he was still waiting. Present, the revelation. "Thunder," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with 3 years of suppressed grief. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I left you. I didn't understand what Grandpa was trying to tell me." as if he'd been waiting for exactly those words. Thunder turned his great head toward her and released a sound unlike anything the gathered crowd had ever heard. Not a bellow or a grunt, but something that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. Emily Patterson looked up from her equipment, her eyes wide. "Dr. Mitchell, you need to see this. That python, it's not constricting anymore. It's almost like it's letting go." The crowd pressed closer, everyone straining to see what was happening. The python's coils had indeed loosened, though it hadn't completely released its grip on Gentle. The great snake's head had dropped to the asphalt, and its breathing had become labored. "It's dying," Emily said quietly. "That python is dying." Thunder seemed to understand before any of the humans did. His stance shifted from defensive to something else, not aggression, but a kind of purposeful determination. He was preparing for something, gathering himself for one final effort to save the creature he loved more than his own life. The storm clouds above them began to break apart, allowing shafts of sunlight to pierce through the gloom. In that golden light, with rain still dripping from the trees and the scent of hope beginning to overcome the smell of fear, Sarah realized that some bonds were strong enough to transcend time, abandonment, and even the approach of death itself. The dying python's grip loosened further, its massive coils unwrapping with the slow inevitability of a clock winding down. Sarah watched in horrified fascination as the great snake's breathing became increasingly labored, each exhale weaker than the last. This wasn't the dramatic confrontation anyone had expected. This was watching a creature slowly surrender to forces beyond its control. "It's not just dying," Emily Patterson said, her voice tight with professional concern. "It's been dying for a while. Look at the condition of its scales, the way its body is positioned. This snake has been sick for weeks, maybe months." The revelation hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. This python, this creature they'd seen as a monster, had been suffering all along, abandoned by owners who'd grown tired of caring for an exotic pet, left to struggle for survival in an environment that could never sustain it. The snake had been slowly starving to death in the Texas wilderness. Thunder seemed to sense the shift in the python's condition before anyone else. The massive bull took a careful step forward, his dark eyes fixed not on the snake, but on Gentle's face. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, the kind of desperate panting that spoke of lungs fighting for space against compressed ribs. "She's going into shock," Sarah said, her veterinary training overriding every other emotion. "We need to get that snake off her now, while it's still weak enough to handle safely." But as she moved toward her medical bag, Thunder did something that stopped everyone in their tracks. The great bull lowered his massive head until his forehead was nearly touching the python's scales, and he made a sound that defied every assumption about bovine communication, a low, almost musical hum that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered. Is he trying to communicate with that snake?" The python's head lifted slightly, its ancient eyes focusing on Thunder's face with what looked impossibly like recognition. For a moment that stretched across species and understanding, predator and prey, abandoned creature and devoted protector seemed to reach some kind of accord. Then the python's coils loosened completely, and it slithered away from Gentle with movements that spoke of exhaustion rather than retreat. The great snake coiled itself into a loose spiral on the rain-wet asphalt, its breathing slow and labored, but no longer threatening. Gentle collapsed onto her side with a sound that tore through every heart present, not the cry of an animal, but something deeper, more personal, the sound of a soul that had held on as long as possible and could hold on no longer. Thunder's response was immediate and devastating. The bull that had stood sentinel for hours, that had faced down crowds of humans and a deadly predator with unwavering courage, suddenly seemed to crumble from within. His massive legs folded beneath him, and he sank to the asphalt beside Gentle, his great head coming to rest against her neck. "No," Sarah breathed, rushing toward them both. "No, you don't get to give up now, not after everything." But even as she knelt beside Gentle's still form, Sarah could see the light fading from the cow's eyes. The python's grip had done internal damage that no amount of veterinary skill could quickly repair. Ribs were certainly broken, possibly organs damaged, without immediate surgical intervention. Gentle was dying. The crowd around them had gone silent except for the soft sound of rain on asphalt and the gentle hum of Thunder's morning song. Even the news cameras seemed respectful of the sacred nature of what they were witnessing. The death of love made manifest. The end of a bond that had defined two lives for decades. Sarah's hands moved automatically, checking for pulse, for breathing, for any sign that there was still time to act. But the terrible truth was becoming clear. They were too late. The damage was too extensive, the trauma too severe. "Dr. Mitchell?" Emily said softly, her hand touching Sarah's shoulder. "Sometimes the kindest thing is to let them go." But Sarah wasn't listening to professional advice anymore. She was listening to something deeper, something that connected her to the 5-year-old girl who had sat in this pasture listening to her grandfather talk about the sacred nature of the bonds between living creatures. "Thunder," she said, her voice cutting through the rain and the silence. "Thunder, look at me." The great bull's head lifted slowly, his eyes meeting hers across the small distance that separated them. In those dark depths, Sarah saw something that medical school had never taught her to recognize. The look of a creature whose world was ending, whose reason for existing was slipping away with each labored breath. "I know you're tired," she whispered, her hand finding the heart-shaped scar on his horn. "I know you've been protecting her for so long that you don't remember how to do anything else. But I need you to trust me one more time. I need you to believe that love doesn't end just because breathing stops." Thunder's eyes held hers, and Sarah could swear she saw understanding flicker in their depths, not the simple comprehension of a domesticated animal, but something deeper, the recognition of one grieving soul by another. Grandpa used to say that the strongest love is the kind that keeps giving even when there's nothing left to give. Sarah continued, her voice breaking as she spoke words she'd never fully understood until this moment. "You've given everything. Thunder. You've been faithful and brave and more loyal than any creature has a right to be. But Gentle needs you to be strong just a little longer," as if summoned by some invisible signal. Dr. Emily Patterson approached with her medical bag. "If we're going to try to save her, we need to do it now," she said quietly. "But I have to tell you, the chances aren't good." Sarah looked from Thunder to Gentle to the python that lay dying nearby. 3 creatures whose lives had become entangled through circumstances none of them had chosen. The abandoned pet, the devoted mate, the traumatized survivor who had found healing in love. All of them victims of human choices. All of them deserving of more than they'd been given. "We're going to try," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years of guilt and a lifetime of lessons she'd been too young to appreciate. "We're going to try because that's what love does. It tries even when the odds are hopeless." The medical intervention that followed would be talked about in veterinary circles for years to come. Working on the side of a highway in deteriorating weather conditions, with a 2,000-pound bull breathing down their necks and a crowd of onlookers documenting every moment, Sarah and Emily performed what amounted to field surgery on a dying cow. Thunder never left Gentle's side. As they worked to stabilize her breathing, to check for internal bleeding, to determine if her injuries were survivable, he maintained his vigil with a patience that bordered on the supernatural. When they needed to reposition her, he seemed to understand, moving carefully to give them space while never breaking physical contact. The rain had stopped, and the late morning sun was beginning to burn through the clouds when Gentle's breathing finally stabilized. Not strong, not healthy, but steady enough to suggest that she might, with proper care and a considerable amount of luck, survive. Thunder's reaction to this small miracle was perhaps the most moving thing the assembled crowd had ever witnessed. The great bull, who had been silent since his earlier humming communication with the python, lifted his head toward the clearing sky and released a sound of pure, wordless gratitude. "She's going to need surgery," Emily said, her hands still working to monitor Gentle's vital signs. "Real surgery, in a proper facility. And even then, we try," Sarah finished, "because that's what family does." As they prepared to transport Gentle to the nearest veterinary hospital, Sarah became aware of the crowd that had gathered around them. Neighbors and strangers, local ranchers and news crews, all of them bearing witness to something that transcended the simple rescue of livestock. "You know," old Pete Gonzalez said, removing his hat as they loaded Gentle into the specially equipped trailer, "your grandfather would be mighty proud of what you did here today." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Around them, Thunder paced anxiously as his mate was prepared for transport, his eyes never leaving her still form. The python, forgotten in the drama of Gentle's rescue, had crawled to the edge of the road where it lay coiled in the grass. It was still alive, still breathing, but clearly dying from whatever illness had driven it to this desperate attack. "What about the snake?" someone asked. Sarah looked at the python, then at Thunder, then at the crowd of people who had come together to witness this strange convergence of love and loss and hope. "We saved them all," she said simply, "because that's what Grandpa would have done." The veterinary hospital in Tyler was not equipped for miracles, but that's exactly what Dr. Marcus Webb found himself attempting as Sarah and her team rushed Gentle through the emergency doors. The massive cow was unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, while Thunder paced frantically in the parking lot, his anguished calls echoing off the brick walls of the medical facility. "Internal bleeding," Dr. Webb announced after his initial examination, his face grim behind surgical glasses. 3 broken ribs, possible punctured lung, and her blood pressure is dropping fast. "Sarah, I have to ask, are you sure this is worth the risk?" The question hung in the sterile air like a challenge to everything Sarah had discovered about herself over the past few hours. Around her. The surgical team waited for an answer that would determine not just Gentle's fate, but the meaning of everything that had led to this moment. "She's carrying a calf," Sarah said quietly, the words falling like stones into still water. The revelation struck everyone in the room simultaneously. Dr. Webb's instruments paused mid-examination, and the surgical nurses exchanged glances that spoke of complications beyond their normal experience. They weren't just trying to save one life anymore. They were racing against time to save two. "How far along?" Dr. Webb asked, his professional composure masking what Sarah recognized as mounting concern. Based on her condition, "I'd guess about 7 months. The calf should be viable if we can stabilize her quickly enough." Sarah's hands moved automatically to check the portable monitors, her veterinary training taking over even as her heart threatened to break from the weight of what she was asking this team to attempt. Outside, Thunder's calls had grown more desperate, more human in their expression of grief. The sound penetrated the walls of the surgical suite, a constant reminder of the love that had brought them to this impossible moment. "Sarah," Dr. Webb said gently, "you need to understand what we're dealing with here. Emergency surgery on a pregnant cow with internal injuries, in a facility that's designed for horses and small farm animals. The odds—" "I know the odds," Sarah interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. "But sometimes the odds don't matter. Sometimes you fight because fighting is the only thing left that makes sense." The surgery began with the careful precision of professionals who understood they were attempting something beyond their normal capabilities. Every cut, every stitch, every measured dose of anesthesia carried the weight of 2 lives hanging in the balance. But 20 minutes into the procedure, their worst fears were realized. "She's crashing," Dr. Webb announced, his voice tight with controlled panic, blood pressure dropping, heartbeat irregular. "We're losing her." The monitors began their electronic death song, flat lines and steady beeps that meant the end of hope. Sarah's hands moved frantically, trying techniques she'd learned in veterinary school but had never used in such desperate circumstances. "Come on, Gentle," she whispered, her voice breaking as she worked. "Don't you dare give up on us now. Thunder's out there waiting for you. Your baby needs you." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah could see the light fading from Gentle's eyes. The massive cow's breathing slowed, then stopped entirely. The surgical suite fell silent except for the monotone cry of the heart monitor and the distant sound of Thunder's increasingly frantic calls from the parking lot. Dr. Webb checked his watch with the grim efficiency of someone accustomed to losing battles against death. Time of death, 11:47 a.m. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, driving her to her knees beside the surgical table. 3 hours of hope, of fighting against impossible odds, of believing that love could somehow triumph over biology and trauma, had ended in the most final way possible. "The calf," Dr. Webb said softly. "We might still have time to save the calf." Emergency cesarean section on a dead cow was not something any of them had been trained for, but desperation drove them forward, working with trembling hands and failing hope. They fought to bring life from death, to salvage something meaningful from the wreckage of their best intentions. The calf was tiny, premature, but breathing, as Dr. Webb lifted the newborn from its mother's still body. The surgical suite filled with the sound of new life announcing itself to a world that had already taken so much away. "It's a female," Dr. Webb said, his voice thick with emotion. "Small, but her vital signs are strong." Sarah cradled the newborn calf, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat against her hands. Here was Thunder's legacy, Gentle's final gift, proof that love could transcend even death. But the victory felt hollow in the face of what they had lost. Outside, Thunder's calls had changed tenor. No longer desperate or frantic, they had become something else, a low, keening sound that seemed to acknowledge what his heart already knew. His mate was gone, and no amount of loyalty or love could bring her back. "We have to tell him," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face as she held the calf close. "We have to let him see his daughter." The scene in the parking lot would haunt everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Thunder stood perfectly still as Sarah approached with the newborn calf, his massive head lowered as if he already understood the terrible trade that had been made. When Sarah placed the calf on the ground before him, Thunder's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He lowered his great head and gently nuzzled the tiny creature, his breath warm against her still damp hide. Then he looked up at Sarah with eyes that held a grief too deep for human understanding. "She didn't make it. Thunder," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking completely. "Gentle didn't make it, but she left us this little miracle. She left us her daughter." Thunder's response was a sound that no one who heard it would ever forget. Not quite a bellow, not quite a sob, but something that transcended species to become pure, universal grief. He stood over his daughter, protecting her even as his own world crumbled around him. The crowd that had gathered in the hospital parking lot watched in respectful silence as the massive bull began what could only be described as a vigil. He would not leave his daughter's side, would not accept food or water, would not acknowledge the well-meaning attempts of humans to comfort him. "He's going to die of grief," Dr. Webb said quietly to Sarah as they watched from the hospital steps. "I've seen it before with bonded animals. Sometimes they just give up." But Sarah was remembering her grandfather's words about the nature of love, about how the strongest bonds were forged in the crucible of loss, and somehow emerged even stronger. Looking at Thunder's devoted protection of his newborn daughter, she began to see not the end of a love story, but perhaps its transformation into something even more powerful. "No," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "He's not going to give up. He's going to live for her, the same way he lived for Gentle. That's what love does. It finds a way to keep going, even when everything seems lost." As if sensing her words, Thunder lifted his head and looked directly at Sarah. In his eyes, she saw not defeat, but something she had never expected to find in the midst of such tragedy: hope. 2 months had passed since that rain-soaked morning on Highway 287, and the East Texas landscape had transformed from the harsh greens of summer into the golden hues of early autumn. Sarah stood at the fence line of what was now officially called Wilson Ranch again, watching Thunder graze peacefully in the pasture where his own story had begun 30 years ago. The little calf, whom they'd named Hope at the suggestion of old Pete Gonzalez, had grown strong and healthy under her father's devoted care. Thunder had proven to be everything Gentle would have wanted in a parent. Patient, protective, and infinitely gentle despite his massive size. The bond between father and daughter had become legendary in their small community, a living testament to the power of love to transform grief into something beautiful. "Hard to believe it's the same bull," Jake Thompson said, joining Sarah at the fence. His weathered hands gripped the top rail as he watched Thunder nudge Hope toward a particularly sweet patch of clover. "2 months ago, I thought we were going to lose him to heartbreak." Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving the pair in the pasture. "Grandpa always said that the measure of love isn't how it handles joy, but how it transforms sorrow." Thunder didn't just survive losing Gentle. He found a way to honor her memory by being the father she would have wanted for their daughter. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. For the first 3 weeks after Gentle's death, Thunder had barely eaten, spending his days standing guard over Hope with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. Sarah had moved into the old farmhouse on the ranch, sleeping in shifts to monitor both animals through the critical early days of Hope's life. It was Dr. Marcus Webb who had first noticed the change. "Look at his eyes," he'd said during one of Hope's routine checkups. "The grief is still there, but it's not consuming him anymore. He's found something to live for." The community had rallied around the unlikely family in ways that restored Sarah's faith in human nature. Neighbors brought hay and feed. Local children came to visit Hope under Thunder's careful supervision, and the Methodist Church had even held a special service to honor Gentle's memory and celebrate Hope's birth. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation had been in Sarah herself. The guilt that had eaten at her for 3 years had gradually given way to something deeper, an understanding of the responsibility that came with being chosen by another living creature, and the sacred nature of the trust that bound families together across species lines. "You know," Jake said, breaking the comfortable silence, "your grandfather would be mighty proud of what you've done here, not just with Thunder and Hope, but with yourself." Sarah smiled, remembering the letter she'd found in Tom Wilson's desk just last week, a sealed envelope with her name on it that had somehow been overlooked during the estate settlement. The words inside had been simple but profound. "Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you're finally ready to understand what I tried to teach you about love. Thunder and Gentle were never my animals. They were always yours. I was just keeping them safe until you grew up enough to see that some bonds can't be broken by time or distance or even death. Take care of them. Sweetheart, they'll take care of you." The python had recovered too, in its own way. The exotic animal sanctuary in Dallas had taken it in, treating the infection that had driven it to desperate measures on that Texas highway. Dr. Patterson had called just last week with news that it was thriving in its new environment, properly fed and cared for by people who understood its needs. "Even monsters deserve compassion when they're just victims of human neglect," Sarah had told the sanctuary director. "That snake wasn't evil. It was abandoned and sick and trying to survive in a world it was never meant to inhabit." As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the pasture in shades of amber and gold, Thunder lifted his massive head and looked directly at Sarah. The heart-shaped scar on his horn caught the light, and for a moment she could swear she heard her grandfather's voice on the autumn breeze. "Love doesn't end when breathing stops, sweetheart. It just finds new ways to grow. Hope, now strong enough to venture a few yards from her father's side, had discovered a butterfly and was following it with the awkward enthusiasm of youth. Thunder watched her with an expression that could only be described as proud, his dark eyes tracking her every movement while remaining alert to any potential threats. "She's got her mother's curiosity," Sarah observed, laughing as Hope tried to catch the butterfly with her nose. "And her father's stubbornness." The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted their peaceful observation. Sarah turned to see a familiar car pulling up the gravel drive, her mother's sedan, driven with the cautious precision that Margaret Wilson had perfected over decades of country living. "Didn't expect to see Mom today," Sarah murmured, but her concern faded when she saw her mother's expression. For the first time in years, Margaret looked truly happy. "I brought someone to meet the famous Thunder," Margaret called out as she opened the car door. From the passenger seat emerged a small girl, maybe 5 years old, with Sarah's dark hair and eyes full of wonder. "This is your cousin Emma," Margaret explained as the little girl pressed against the fence with breathless excitement. "She's been asking about the brave bull she saw on the news ever since the story went viral." Emma's face lit up as Thunder approached the fence, moving with the careful deliberation he'd learned when interacting with small humans. The massive bull lowered his head until he was at the child's eye level, and Emma reached through the fence rails to touch his nose with tiny, fearless fingers. "He's beautiful," Emma whispered, her voice filled with the same awe Sarah remembered feeling at that age. "Is it true he saved his baby from the scary snake?" "He saved a lot more than that," Sarah said softly, lifting Emma up so she could see over the fence better. "He saved all of us, in different ways." As they watched, Hope came trotting over to investigate the visitors, her young legs carrying her with increasing confidence. The calf approached the fence with her father's cautious intelligence, studying the humans with bright, curious eyes. "She looks just like her mama," Margaret said quietly, and Sarah was surprised to hear genuine emotion in her mother's voice. "Your grandfather was right about those two. They were never just cattle." The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed to set the entire ranch ablaze with color. Thunder gathered Hope close to his side, beginning the evening ritual that had replaced his vigil over Gentle's grave, a gentle tour of the pasture that ended at the small memorial stone Sarah had placed beneath the old oak tree. Grandpa always said that sunset was when the veil between this world and the next was thinnest. Sarah told Emma as they watched Thunder and Hope complete their circuit. "He said that's when those we've lost can see how much we still love them." Emma nodded with the serious acceptance that children bring to profound truths. "The baby bull talks to her mama every night, doesn't she?" "I think she does," Sarah agreed, her heart full as she watched Thunder nuzzle Hope gently before they settled down for the night beneath the spreading branches of the oak tree. As they walked back toward the house, Margaret slipped her arm through Sarah's with a gesture that bridged years of misunderstanding. "I'm sorry I didn't see what Daddy was trying to tell us about this place," she said quietly. "About the kind of love that makes a home." Sarah squeezed her mother's arm, thinking about the generations of Wilsons who had learned about loyalty and devotion from the animals they'd chosen to call family. "It's never too late to understand," she said, Thunder taught me that love doesn't operate on human timelines. That night, as Sarah sat on the porch listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening peace, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the deep contentment that comes from being exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you were meant to do. In the pasture, thunder's low, contented rumble mixed with hope's softer sounds, creating a lullaby that spoke of love transcending loss, of families that choose each other across species lines, and of the sacred promise that some bonds are strong enough to bridge even the gap between life and death. The story of Thunder and Gentle had become legend, but the story of Thunder and Hope was just beginning. Message for American seniors. Sometimes life teaches us its most profound lessons through the simplest acts of devotion. Thunder's story reminds us that real love isn't about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It's about showing up, day after day, for those who matter most. Like many of us who've reached our golden years, Thunder faced the heartbreak of losing his life partner. Yet he found the strength to transform his grief into something beautiful, a legacy of love for the next generation. His unwavering dedication to Little Hope mirrors the countless ways we've loved our own families through triumph and tragedy, proving that the bonds we forge in this life are stronger than any force that tries to break them. Thunder didn't just survive his loss. He honored Gentle's memory by becoming the father she would have wanted for their daughter. This is the kind of love that defines our generation: steadfast, sacrificial, and enduring. We understand that true happiness isn't the absence of sorrow, but the courage to keep loving despite it. Thunder's heart-shaped scar reminds us that our own scars don't diminish our capacity for love. They deepen it, making us more compassionate, more grateful for each precious day we're given. What moment in your own life taught you that love can transform grief into hope? Have you ever witnessed an act of devotion that reminded you of the sacred bonds between living creatures? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love has shaped your journey.